All right, so it's the 25th. Okay, Sunday school time. The lesson today, it's session 10 in the study guide. And I was telling Jasmine a few minutes ago, if you have one and you want to look at it, the picture inside, accepting discipline. Can you see that from where you're at? Everybody's eyes are good enough to see that. Anybody ever been in that position? Had to stand in a corner, sit in a corner. What?
Couldn't have had that happen.
What?
I can't think of anybody where that couldn't happen.
Well, when I was a kid, I don't remember that I ever had to stand in the corner, I think, because the discipline that was put out was a little bit more physical than go stand in a corner. But, and we'll get into, that's the whole point of the lesson. The title of it's called Accepting Discipline. And the subtitle says, God uses discipline from society, family, and others to shape his people. And it's, I don't know, this, because of the virus, this quarterly was supposed to have been done back in the, I don't know if this was spring or summer. It was called Summer 2020. So it was delayed. And it's funny in a interesting way to me how God uses events, because as I look around in the world at the news and what's going on, this lesson is really poignant to me about why we need discipline in our lives. And when I first started reading the introduction, I thought, okay, when I think discipline, well, let me ask you this. When you think discipline, what does it bring to mind? Discipline. Whooping, spanking, stand in the corner, timeout. Okay, that's what I thought, especially with the picture that's in here showing the little boy, standing in the corner, being disciplined. But let me read the introduction here, and this is the other word, because the words have multiple meanings, and discipline is another one that is like that. My first thought was, when I was growing up, I got spankings, and so that's what I think of the first thought of discipline. But it says, mention the word discipline, and people give you all kinds of reactions. To many, discipline connotes drudgery, or kind of a oppressive, very somber. But it says, but few things happen in life that are fruitful and meaningful that do not involve discipline. The athlete, the scientist, the theologian, and the businessman must be disciplined and focused if they are to succeed. In the same way, believers should welcome discipline for the purpose of holiness. So when you think of the discipline in that way, it's having discipline, being disciplined. Whatever your pursuits are, sports, academics, whatever it is, crafts, art, music. A disciplined person, that means that you're, what's the right word? When you're disciplined about practicing, for example. Okay, that's what I'm trying to say. If you want to get better at things, you are disciplined and continue to pursue it and practice it. So there's the other side of that discipline word. Now, when I read the introduction, I said, oh, okay, so it's going to be focusing on that, having that discipline within you to do the right thing. Well, today's lesson actually discusses both as we get into it. So another thing about this, we talk about Proverbs and who wrote the Proverbs. Solomon was the guy who put down a lot of Proverbs. I think it was around 3,000 references somewhere in the Bible. I believe that's what it says. Interestingly, in the understand the context, it says apparently some of the wise sayings of Solomon were collected under the reign of King Hezekiah. That's a great story of Hezekiah, but it says Hezekiah ruled Judah from 715 to 686 BC, over 200 years after the reign of Solomon. So in my mind, I think if Solomon's the guy who comes up with these proverbs and he's saying them and someone's writing them down, because I don't know if Solomon himself actually wrote them down, you think, okay, the book of the book of Proverbs was developed or written while Solomon was the king. Well, clearly that's not true. If Hezekiah collected some of Solomon's Proverbs and that collection was put into the books, I'm not really sure of the time frame of when it was written. Okay, well, what we can since Hezekiah was 200 years after Solomon, as it says in the book. What we do know is that whatever's in the Bible came from God through man. So I don't want to belabor that except to say, it says here, Hezekiah collected these. When I looked in my Bible, it says 25 through 29 in the study guide. Hezekiah's collection of Solomon's Proverbs, chapters 25 through 29, gives us insights from God's wisdom that enable us to make right decisions. So when I go back in my Bible to chapter 25, the subtitle says Proverbs of Solomon, selected by the men of Hezekiah. So in my King James, the Scofield version, it says it's Solomon's Proverbs, but they're selected by the men of Hezekiah. So it affirms that. And it's interesting that the next subtitle for every chapter from 25 to 29 is called Warnings and Instructions. So again, it's the men of Hezekiah's time, or Hezekiah himself, whoever was involved in this, saw these as important warnings and instructions. So we'll look at just a handful of that, actually just one aspect of it here today. So again, in the introduction, it says that these Hezekiah's collection of Solomon's Proverbs gives us insights from God's wisdom that enable us to make right decisions. It also provides us with the description of a fool, a sluggard, a busybody, and a liar. So you've all probably heard those words or some variation of what they mean. And so it starts with a fool as someone who rejects God's wisdom. So that's the biblical definition, at least from the study guide, of what a fool is. You can hear people be called fools because they do foolish things. But biblically, it says that a fool is someone who rejects God's wisdom. A sluggard is a person who personifies laziness. Okay, so a slug. I hear sometimes in the morning if I sleep in from my bright-eyed and bushy-tailed bride, "Get out of bed, you lazy slug." Well, slug has a couple of things. Slug is this snail-like thing that moves very, very slowly, right? You've all probably seen those. But slug is also short for sluggard, which is a lazy person. Busybody is an individual who meddles in the quarrels of others, spreads rumors, and loves to gossip, which obviously is another not good thing. And then finally, a liar, it says, is portrayed as a phony who will eventually be trapped in the snare that his or her lies have set. So those are just some things that are described in this Hezekiah's collection of Solomon's Proverbs for chapters 25 to 29, just a few. But it says that the collection also includes a series of proverbs that shed light on how to deal with difficult people. In 27, 3 through 4, how to identify and maintain authentic friendships. And finally, the value of discipline. Discipline is the focus of this week's study from the book of Proverbs. So it gives a reference in there for all those things. I actually looked up the one that talked about how to deal with difficult people, which is 27, 3 to 4, just to get an idea. It's just a couple of verses. And then, of course, chapter 29 is the one that deals with discipline, which is what we're talking about today. Okay, so there's two sets of verses. Chapter 29, verses 1 through 3, and then the second set of verses is 12 through 20. So I'm going to read through those, and then we'll see what Solomon had to say about discipline. So 29, 1 through 3, we'll start with that. And it says, "He that being often reproved hardeneth his neck." Reproved means to be chastised, is kind of how I think of that. To be reproved means to be chastised, and we'll look at CSB here in just a minute. So he that being often reproved hardeneth his neck shall suddenly be destroyed, and that without remedy. When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice, but when the wicked beareth rule, the people mourn. Whoso loveth wisdom rejoiceth his father, but he that keepeth company with harlots spendeth his substance. All right, so there's the first three verses. Let's read 12 through 20. And so that was kind of the general thought. And here's 12 through 20 to give us a bit more specific. Starting in 12, "If a ruler hearken to lies, all his servants are wicked. The poor and deceitful man meet together. The Lord lighteneth both their eyes. The king that faithfully judgeth the poor, his throne shall be established forever. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame. When the wicked are multiplied, transgression increaseth, but the righteous shall see their fall. Correct thy son, and he shall give thee rest. Yea, he shall give delight unto thy soul. Where there is no vision, the people perish, but he that keepeth the law, happy is he. A servant will not be corrected by words, for though he understand, he will not answer. Seest thou a man that is hasty in his words? There is more hope of a fool than him. So there's the verses. They put us back on the CSB, and then we'll head back up to the top. Here we go. All right. So, that's how we'll look at the verses from the study guide. Okay. Verses 1 through 3, that's the first section, and the subtitles, it's the goal. So here's, again, from Solomon's Proverbs through Hezekiah's men or Hezekiah, the first 3 verses. Here is the goal. So let's look at 1 through 3 again. One who becomes stiff-necked. When you think about stiff-necked, particularly in the context of biblical and humbling yourself to God, worshiping God, obeying God, and then you can extrapolate that to parents, teachers, police, those in authority over us, whether we be young or older. There's always someone in authority over us for our whole lives. Okay, and if you think of the easy one to me is the law, the law of the United States. Right, it applies to all of us, every U.S. citizen. Stiff-necked means if you are expected to bow to the Lord, to your parents, to obey to the law, and you're stiff-necked, meaning that I'm not going to subject myself. Think about that. If you bow, that's showing some humility and a little bit of submission. Well, a stiff-necked person is not going to bow to whatever that authority is. Okay. One who becomes stiff-necked after many reprimands will be shattered instantly beyond recovery. We'll come to that, what he's saying here in a second. When the righteous flourish, the people rejoice, but when the wicked rule, people groan, which is another thing that's very poignant to me when we think about the election that's coming up very soon, and just the country and the world in general, what that implies. And then finally, verse 3, a man who loves wisdom brings joy to his father, but one who consorts with prostitutes destroys his wealth. And we'll talk about what that references here in just a few minutes. All right. So again, back to verse 1. I'm on page 93 in the study guide. It says, Solomon began with a solemn warning, alerting God's people that if they developed an attitude of stubbornness and rebellion, they would be shattered. Just as something brittle can be easily broken, Solomon warned that God's judgment of stiff-necked people would be sudden and shattering. Okay, so when you think about something brittle, I was trying to think of a good example, and the best one that I can think of, obviously, if you had a rod of glass, think about a pencil-shaped rod, dowel of glass. So it's not really big around, but if you try to bend glass, it doesn't want to bend, right? If you think about, I don't remember if it was a Chinese proverb about a tree versus a reed, and when the wind blows, this tree is going to resist that wind. But when the wind blows hard enough, what happens to the tree? It breaks, it falls, and then it dies. Whereas a reed, which is a little bit more flexible, can kind of flex with the wind. That's kind of saying something about don't be stiff-necked or stiff-backed, I guess is kind of how I interpret that. But think about that glass rod. It's very brittle. It doesn't want to bend, but when it goes too far, it shatters, right? A million pieces. That's kind of how I think of that. Well, that's what this is saying, that if you are resistant to this authority, to this discipline, whatever it is, over time, you're more and more resistant. Well, at some point, something is going to happen that's going to break you. You're going to be shattered instantly, it says, beyond recovery. So what he's saying is that if you continue to resist, to avoid that discipline, when you break it, it's going to be beyond recovery. Now, however, it says in the beginning of the verse, after many reprimands, and it talks about that in the study guide. It says, yet God is gracious in that he will give many reprimands prior to his judgment. Okay, and that's what this shattered instantly is. Ultimately, there is going to be a judgment, certainly with respect to God. There will come a day when the non-Christians will face God's judgment to where they're sent to an eternity in a lake of fire. But God does give many chances, which is good for all of us. And hopefully, as a child, as a young person, if you disobey, if you get in trouble, hopefully on the first time something that you disobey or you get out of sorts with the authority, parent, teacher, law, whatever it is, hopefully on the first time they just don't wreck you totally, right? You need to have that opportunity to be corrected, to learn lessons, and to learn. And it's the same with God. Uh, Although there does come a point to where God says, okay, I guess this one is irredeemable, I guess. And again, that's the ultimate judgment. Okay. Verses 2 and 3, when the righteous flourish, the people rejoice, but when the wicked rule, people groan. A man who loves wisdom brings joy to his father, but one who consorts with prostitutes destroys his wealth. So on page 93, and under verses 2 and 3, it says the outcome for a person who rejects God's wisdom stands in stark contrast to the future for God's people who have placed their trust in Him. Okay, so here's who he's comparing those who reject God's wisdom and those who accept it. Those who walk with God will flourish as the Lord works in them. When the righteous flourish, the people rejoice. As a result of being righteous, their families and their communities will rejoice. When the righteous walk in God's wisdom, everyone benefits. And I would say that's everyone around them that they can influence. Conversely, the individual who lives an undisciplined life and makes foolish choices depletes the family of its resources. And here's why. And this kind of takes us back to what Pastor Richard talked about last week. He says it all the time. It says in the study guide, self-indulgence puts people on a path of living that is focused on satisfying their lusts. So a lot of our problem as humans comes from that innate human nature, which is kind of self first. I want to take care of me first, and then I'll worry about everything else. Whereas God says, trust me, I'll take care of you. He told that, Jesus told that to the disciples. When you go out on your missionary journeys, you don't even need to take a spare set of clothes. You don't need to take money. You don't need to take food. I will provide for you. Okay. So if we think of it in that terms, so self-indulgence, it says, puts people on a path of living that is focused on satisfying their lusts. And it says, in the King James, it says harlot. In the CSB, it says prostitute. But the study guide points out that lust takes many forms, whether it's, love or lust for a man or a woman. But it says whatever its form, when you think about the other things that people love, money, I want to have a big house. I want to have a fast car. I want to have the best clothes. I want to have that pair of tennis shoes that I just have to have. So there's all sorts of things that people strive for. Okay, so it says lust takes many forms. Whatever its form, the outcome always takes the shape of destruction. If you let that become the overriding thing in your life, is that I have to have this, whatever it is, person, thing, house, fame, success. If that takes control of you, self-indulgence, then it puts you on a path of destruction. All right, and that's why in verse 2 it says, when the righteous flourish, people rejoice. But when the wicked rule, people groan. And this relates a little bit to leadership, which we'll come to in a moment too. If someone's in charge, not a good person, that doesn't have their focus correct, it affects everyone below them that they're subject to. All right. The last paragraph on page 93. Too often we view discipline as a penalty rather than a benefit. And again, that was my first thought. When I see the word discipline, I think of the times when I was naughty and got a spanking. Too often we view discipline as a penalty rather than a benefit. But when we say no to one thing, we're saying yes to something else. So here's that other definition of discipline. The athlete says no to unhealthy food so he can say yes to finishing a marathon. Okay, eating unhealthy has lots of adverse effects, not just for athletes, right? Particularly as you start to get older, eating unhealthy can have bad health effects. The farmer, it says no to prolonged naps at harvest time so he can say yes to ingathering the harvest. You think about, like I said, musicians, students. To be the best, if you really want to be good at or try to be the best at something, it requires a self-discipline to pursue that, or else You may be okay at things, but not as good as you could be. Living with discipline, it says, puts us in the position to flourish spiritually and relationally. So there's again kind of where the focus is of the this discipline. Now we're going to go ahead to verses 12 and 13. And so we went from the goal, which was the subtitle. Now the subtitle is the availability. Here's where it kind of relates it again back to leadership. Start with anyway. Starting verse 12. If a ruler listens to lies, all his officials will be wicked. I relate this when I think about this. Think about, because we're in this election season, think about the job of a president of the United States. And I've thought about this often, thinking that whatever politician, whether it be the mayor, congressman, senator, all the way up to president, these jobs, particularly president, are so big that it boggles my mind to think that one man or woman could hope to be good at being the president, as an example. Now, you may have someone, and certainly if they are not grounded in morality and the influences on them that give them some type of discipline, a lot of people look at politics as a way to enrich themselves, okay, in many different ways. So, again, to go back to the point of how can one person expect to have all the knowledge that would be required to successfully be the president? Well, like in a lot of things that require leadership, you need to surround yourself with wise advisors. I'll put myself in the position, if I was the president, I don't know the first thing about healthcare because I'm, one, not a doctor. I was in the military, so my health care was provided. If I got sick, I went to the hospital on the base and I was taken care of. So from my perspective, I don't know about much, if anything, about healthcare per se. And that's just one of many. So I would have to rely on people that I could trust to advise me. All right. Now, to go back to verse 12, if a ruler listens to lies, all his officials will be wicked. Who is the father of lies? Of course, that's Satan. He's named in the Bible as the father of lies. On the other side, in verse 13, the poor and the oppressor have this in common. The Lord gives light to the eyes of both. So both the poor and a wicked ruler have the same thing in common. The Lord gives his light to the eyes of both. He makes available his light or wisdom, no matter who you are, whether you're good, wicked, rich, poor. God's light, his wisdom, the Bible, is available to all. So the study guide says wisdom or light is available to all people. Biblical theologians speak of general revelation. We've talked about this before. There's the general revelation, it says, is God's revelation of himself in general through his creation, reason, or other means that are common to all humans, meaning that I can look around and I have to, when I look at this world, when I look at how we were created, look at the animals, the planet, and think, okay, did this really just happen to me? I got to say no. I don't see how this could have just happened. And of course, the Bible verifies and backs that up. But God makes that wisdom or that light available to everybody. That's that general revelation. Wisdom is available to the ruler, his officials, and to all people. There is no excuse for foolish living or leading. Again, back to those leaders. There's no excuse for it because the wisdom is available out there. Now, whether or not the poor and the oppressor seek and embrace the wisdom of God is quite another thing. And that's where it takes a deliberate effort to seek that wisdom. It's presented in Sunday school and church. If you read the Bible, it's right there in front of your very eyes. And again, I would encourage you, even if it's a Bible story book, something just to so you can see there are so many of what we call the Bible stories of famous people that are amazing to see the people in the Bible and what they did, the things that God did when you think about parting the Red Sea, leading the children of Israel through the wilderness, and how they were good for one time, and then they would kind of turn away and start grumbling, and God would kind of correct them, and they would turn back over and over again. Just those stories, when you relate it to today, I look at it as I'm reading it, and I shake my head and go, how can these people not? When God was leading them by day with the pillar of the cloud and by night by the pillar of fire, when God was literally physically present there, how could they not obey him? How could they stray? And then I think, well, I've got God physically present in my life through my knowledge of the Bible, my salvation through Jesus. And at the same time, there are times when I make a conscious decision that's not in contrary to what God would have me do. Okay, a word, a thought, an act. Now, again, the difference I would say is if that, first of all, if I think about doing something that's contrary to God, hopefully I get a conviction right then. And I go, you know what, let me think about this for a second and not do that. If I still fail, then I get a conviction that says, okay, why did you do that? Why did you say that? And hopefully I turn to God and say, Lord, please forgive me for that and help me to be better in the future, help me to be stronger. We've talked about how it says God will not let you be tempted beyond what you can avoid. And at the same time, so as I shake my head at the Egyptians in the wilderness, God, you guys keep making that mistake, I do the same thing. So it's common to humans. Okay. All right. Let's see here. Verse 14, a king who judges the poor with fairness, his throne will be established forever. Excuse me. Back in those days, citizens didn't have a voice in their government. This is from the study guide on page 94. They had no other choice but to submit to the ruler's authority. That's how powerful that ruler was in that day. Today, whoever our president is, whatever they say, we can still choose to say, you know what, I disagree with you. The laws of the land, we can choose to disobey those laws. Now, there's consequences if we get caught. But back in those days, whatever the ruler said, that was the law. And you had no choice but to obey it. And the consequences could be pretty severe if you didn't. I mean, of course, today, if you disobey the law and do things like murder, the consequences are still severe. But back then, again, the point was the ruler was the ultimate authority. Right? Now, to shift gears, in verse 14, it says, as noted above, the ruler had wisdom at his disposal. The picture in verse 14 is of a wise and godly king who uses the light or wisdom available to him to lead his people in good and positive ways. Again, verse 14, a king who judges the poor with fairness, his throne will be established forever, meaning that people will respect him. He'll be remembered. There were a lot of kings that as soon as they died, killed, they were out of their office, they were forgotten, and people made a conscious effort to say, okay, that was a bad one. We're not going to revere them. Excuse me, we're not going to remember them. We're not going to celebrate them. We're finished with them. All right. However, the ones who use wisdom and judge the poor with fairness, meaning anyone who is subject to them, will be remembered. It's going to be established forever. And the bottom line, and on the bottom of page 94, again, Solomon's point was clear. There is no excuse for operating outside the wisdom of God. To do so will warrant the chastening judgment of God. Ultimately, that's who we're responsible for. When we have learned and know what God says in His Word, man's law is important. That's our civil society. We have to obey those laws to get along in society. But man's law applies until the day we die, and then it matters no more. God's law applies forever. What God expects. Now, as we go to verse 15, the subtitle says the responsibility. Here's where it kind of gets down to a little bit of the nitty-gritty of practically speaking for us. Okay, 15 through 17. A rod of correction. There's that whooping. It wasn't a rod of correction. Well, it depends on how you define a rod. It was a belt when I was a kid, or a switch, a paddle in school, and I don't think they still do that anymore. But a rod means something, a physical punishment. All right. A rod of correction imparts wisdom, but a youth left to himself is a disgrace to his mother. When the wicked increase, rebellion increases, but the righteous will see their downfall. Discipline your child, and it will bring you peace of mind and give you delight. So again, this is kind of goes more to the practical discipline. I'm on page 95 now. It says in verses 12 through 14, Solomon applied God's wisdom to the rulers of nations. In 15 to 17, he addressed parents. Solomon reminded parents of their responsibility to discipline their children. Failing to do so creates a selfish and wicked generation that will be outlived by the righteous. Okay? So, do you all consider yourselves a selfish and wicked generation? I hope not.
That depends on how you see the generation.
Well,
Because this generation is
you're correct. Now, generically speaking, and again, to go back to just pure human nature, we are all apt to be selfish and wicked. And that doesn't mean we're all going to go out and kill people or beat them up or, law of the jungle. You have it. I want it. I'm bigger than you, or I've got a bigger gun than you. I'm going to take it. I mean, that's ultimate um, selfishness, law of the jungle. And again, kind of what society's laws are meant to prevent. But this, again, to go to parents' responsibility to discipline their children, that's where it starts. And when I say parents, that doesn't necessarily mean mom and dad. Hopefully it does. But there are lots of circumstances. We all know what's important is that there is some discipline. Left to ourselves, we tend to not want to discipline ourselves as far as be self-disciplined and do the right thing all the time. Here's the consequence. Failing to do so, to have that discipline, creates a selfish and wicked generation that will be outlived by the righteous. Now, that's one thing that's for sure. Even in this time, and again, y'all hopefully don't spend a lot of time watching the news, but when you think about things like, have any of you ever heard of the knockout game? Have you heard of that? Where somebody will just be walking down the street and just hit somebody. I mean, whether they walk up behind them or walking the other way, and they punch them in the face. And I mean, their intent is to try to knock somebody out. And there was a lady who was 90-something years old walking down the street using a cane or a walker, I can't remember. And some fellow walking the other way, as he gets to her, he didn't hit her, he pushed her, and she fell over because he thought that was, I don't know what he thought. But there are people that actually hit someone. I look at those and I think, what in the world is in that person's mind that they think that that's okay? How can anybody think something like that's okay? And now, to me, that is kind of the ultimate, having never been held accountable, because they don't, even though these are filmed, and a lot of times because of the film, somebody sees it. You all know if you've got a brain that you can look at, things go viral. And somebody that sees that's going to say, wait, I know that guy. I know that girl. I know who that is. And someone then may further say, but the police are looking for this. Hey, police, I know who that is. It's Bill. It's my cousin, whatever. And sometimes they're held to account. But the thought that that person thinks that it's okay to hit someone or push someone down and they're going to get away with it, that's kind of where this goes. That's the ultimate end to consequence of no discipline. Having never been told no, having never been told spanked or never spanked, had to stand in the corner, been in timeout, to think that I don't have to listen to you because you've never been made to respect authority or listen. And it's, again, I do look at some news. I see a lot of people that are, protesting. And in the United States, protest is part of our rights. That is First Amendment, the right to peacefully assemble and protest. I think no rational American citizen would dispute that. Now, what it doesn't mean is you can get together in a peaceful protest and then suddenly decide, okay, we're protesting and they're not paying attention to us. Well, we got to do something else to make them pay attention and listen to us. So we're going to start breaking glass, setting things on fire, turning cars over, throwing things at police, stealing things. That's not in the Constitution something that's allowed to do. Okay, and people think for whatever reason that they can get away with it. And part of that is because people are getting away with it right now, and it's very complicated. I don't understand it. When the police are there and mayors or whoever that are over the police say, we don't want to get anybody hurt or start any fights, so just let them be. If they're not hurting people, if they're just destroying things and stealing things, let them be. I don't understand that. But again, it goes back to those people apparently have never been told no, were never held to account for whatever it was that they did as kids. And now they're acting out in a way that can become dangerous. And ultimately, if police do try to stop this, it turns into a fight against the police of all things. My generation, and there are people in my generation too that are resistant to authority, but I don't know. It's very, very dangerous. Now, let me come back onto the lesson here. To go back to the root of this, disciplining a child, that's the responsibility of parents. And then obviously teachers, the police, those authority figures, that's part of it, is making people understand there are consequences. There's accountability. And ultimately, again, God will hold everybody accountable in one way or the other. But back to the point of the child, on the bottom of 95, it says, disciplining a child does not warrant abusing a child. So there's the line for parents. And there are a lot of parents, for whatever reason, maybe they're young, maybe they just don't have the knowledge base of how to discipline people. I mean, when we first had Mandy, I don't know how to, when I was a kid, my discipline was pretty strict from my dad. My mom was a little bit different, but she wouldn't hesitate to swat us if she felt like she needed to. But Dad was the more physical disciplinarian in my life. So again, a lot of parents don't know how to discipline. Either they weren't disciplined themselves, or it's just something new. So you have to be careful to discipline with love. The ultimate goal is to teach them something, not to hurt them. Okay, to discipline a child is to find age-appropriate ways, both positive and negative, to correct bad behavior and to reward good behavior. Think about that in terms of citizenship, being a model citizen. How do you do that? Well, you have to know what's right and wrong. You have to be willing to do the right and avoid the wrong. That kind of goes all through your life. Discipline is nurturing, instructive, corrective, and boundary setting. Think about all those things: nurturing, instructive, corrective, and boundary setting. Those are good things. So from that perspective, discipline really is an act of love. It's to teach people the right way to be. Those who don't do it are doing their children a disservice, and again, ultimately society, because until and unless they are taught to have that discipline or accountability, they have no boundaries, and it can be dangerous. The Apostle Paul wrote to fathers, it says, don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. So Paul said, you don't want to discipline your children to the point that it makes them hate you. You don't want your children to fear you or be mad at you all the time, but they do need to be disciplined. So do it with love and with a purpose, with an intent. Sadly, it says in the study guide, too many parents raise undisciplined children who bring dishonor to their families. So that's at the family level, that's not good. At the societal level, it's not good too. Gracious but firm discipline may be the most loving posture parents can take toward their children. So think about it that way. When you're disciplined, if you're called down, it would always embarrass me if I was to ever get called out or called down. My face would turn red, because you don't want to have that kind of negative attention to you, right? I still remember the one lick that I had from a paddle in school. My whole career was at rugby, cutting up with my friends between classes. And one of the teachers there, he just said, "Okay, turn up against put your hands on the lockers," or whatever he did, and he whap one time on my rear end. And it was during the changeover from class to class, so there was a crowd out there, and I thought I was a pretty good kid, and we were just goofing off. And he was going to establish right then this discipline. What he saw he didn't like, and he had the authority to And it wasn't, he didn't beat me. It was just one smack on the rear end, and it made me feel about this big. It embarrassed me, and I said, never again will that happen to me. Okay, and that's sort of the intent, is to there's an accountability, not to embarrass people per se, but just understand there's all right, let's see. To close out this part, it says, this reminds us that discipline benefits both the child and the parent. Parents are responsible to raise their children with loving but firm discipline. The child's responsibility is to respond to that discipline with respect and obedience. Okay, respect and obedience. Really, it is for your own good. This is true of society as a whole, and it is true in the family where loving discipline is absent. Now, here's the believe it or not part, and it says it on page 96. Children, whether they want to admit it or not, need and want loving discipline. You need boundaries. Security is found in discipline. When discipline is lacking, a child will run wild. Setting boundaries can be unpleasant for both the parent and the child, but boundaries and discipline are necessary for the maturing of a child into an adult. So that's kind of the bottom line of discipline as it pertains to youth as you're growing up. It really should be with the intent of making you a better person and wanting to be a better person, to do the right thing, and to help other people that didn't have the benefit of the discipline that maybe you did, to help them be better people as well. All right, to close this out, 18 through 20, without revelation, it says people run wild, but one who follows divine instruction will be happy. A servant cannot be disciplined by words, though he understands, he doesn't respond. Do you see someone who speaks too soon? There is more hope for a fool than for him. So the last part of this, and this kind of focuses on verse 19. Solomon pointed to God's revelation. God's revelation is the Bible. He revealed that to man, and then now here it is for us. It's a really good instruction manual. Sometimes it's kind of hard to understand, but that's why you're here. Hopefully, Sunday school, the worship service, whatever activities you participate in that help reinforce the Bible, including reading it yourself. But it says, Solomon reminded his readers that words alone do not constitute wisdom, but acting on those words is required. The person who heeds instruction avoids the folly of acting with haste. So a servant can't be disciplined by words. A servant can hear, can read, but that means nothing unless they act on the good things that they hear or read, right? Just like us. So it says the true wisdom and discipline begin with the revelation of God's truth. You have to hear it, see it, be introduced to it. That revelation of God keeps his people from running wild and enables them to live with joy. The Bible is the true and trustworthy revelation of God. It is the all-sufficient source of wisdom that reveals the principles by which God judges us. So it does tell you, here's the right thing to do, here are wrong things to do. Ultimately, we'll be held accountable. The founders of the United States, they did use biblical principles to stand up this country. All right? The Word of God is the standard by which all human conduct and opinions should be tried. God created us. He made the rules. We should try to live by His rules. And to close it out, it says, God's revealed truth must be put into action. Words alone do not produce wise or disciplined living. Obedience does. All right? So there's kind of where the lesson goes. Hearing about it, knowing about it isn't enough. We need to act on it. And then the other part of that I just want to reinforce is hopefully when you're disciplined, it's, I say fair. I would say with love. If it's not, I mean, there were times when I was a kid and I thought, I didn't deserve that, or that was a little more than I should have gotten. Well, one thing, if nothing else, it taught me I don't want to have that happen again. So it helped me to steer toward that right path. And again, God will ultimately do the same thing. Questions? Comments? All right. Thank you for your attention, for your fantastic discipline. And I'm really glad that you're here. All right. Let me close this up.